All right. Today it's very exciting because we're starting a new chapter.
Wow.
So today we are in chapter 27 of the book of Matthew, which is the second last chapter of the book. And these chapters are quite lengthy, so we have a little bit of an excuse for taking our time in them. What we saw last week was everything leading up to the verdict of Jesus' execution, where Jesus is betrayed and arrested. He's denied by Peter. He stands before the council. He is adjured. He's put under oath by the high priest himself to find out what kind of Messiah Jesus is claiming to be. Are you the kind of Messiah who's claiming divinity for yourself, to be the Son of God? And Jesus' answer seals his route to the cross. And so that brings us now up to chapter 27, because as much as the high priests would like to put Jesus to death on their own terms, this is a period of history where the highest court in the land, the Sanhedrin, cannot actually legally put anyone to death. Only the Romans in Israel can put someone to death. They've taken that right for themselves. And so that's not that they can't kill someone and then ask for forgiveness later. They certainly do that with Stephen. Just a couple short years later, they get so mad at Stephen that they just take him out and stone him, and they got away with that one. But here, they wanted to be fully legitimate in the eyes of the people, because as we've seen, Jesus is super popular amongst the people, and so they know that if they want to get away with this and do away with Jesus, they have to go through Rome. And so that's what we see happening next. And so let's read our text together. Let's read to verse 26 together. I don't know if we'll get there in our study, but we'll at least have read that portion. So,
early in the morning, all the chief priests and the elders of the people came to the decision to put Jesus to death. They bound him, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate the governor. When Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse and returned the 30 silver coins to the chief priests and the elders.
"I have sinned,"
he said.
"for I have betrayed innocent blood."
"What is that to us?"
they replied.
"That's your responsibility."
So Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself. The chief priests picked up the coins and said,
"It is against the law to put this into the treasury, since it is blood money."
So they decided to use the money to buy the potter's field as a burial place for foreigners. That is why it has been called the Field of Blood to this day. Then what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. They took the 30 silver coins, the price set on him by the people of Israel, and they used them to buy the potter's field, as the Lord commanded me. Meanwhile, Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him,
"Are you the king of the Jews?"
"Yes, it is as you say."
Jesus replied. When he was accused by the chief priests and the elders, he gave no answer. Then Pilate asked him,
"Don't you hear the testimony they are bringing against you?"
But Jesus made no reply, not even to a single charge, to the great amazement of the governor. Now it was the governor's custom at the feast to release a prisoner chosen by the crowd. At that time they had a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. So when the crowd had gathered, Pilate asked them,
"Which one do you want me to release to you? Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ?"
For he knew it was out of envy that they had handed Jesus over to him. While Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat, his wife sent him this message.
Don't have anything to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him.
But the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus executed.
Which of the two do you want me to release to you?
Asked the governor.
Barabbas!
They answered.
What shall I do then with Jesus who is called Christ?
Pilate asked. They all answered.
Crucify him! Why? What crime has he committed?
Asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder.
Crucify him!
When Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that instead an uproar was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd.
I am innocent of this man's blood.
He said.
It is your responsibility.
All the people answered.
Let his blood be on us!
And on our children!
Then he released Barabbas to them. But he had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified.
So if we go back to verses 1 and 2, we see that the sentence is finalized. Everyone agrees Jesus deserves to die for his blasphemy, for claiming to be the Son of God, which is claiming divinity to himself, which is blasphemy according to the law, at least how they interpret it. And so verse 2 tells us that they tie him up like a criminal, and they lead him away to take him to the Roman governor named Pilate. And sometimes, just a note on Pilate, sometimes we, as Christians, we have a bit of a sympathetic view of Pilate, because as we see, he makes a certain amount of effort to get Jesus off. It says here that he knew that this was just a political game. He knew that they had handed him over to him out of envy. So he knew that the charges were trumped up. Even his wife warned him from suffering much in a dream. According to the other Gospels, he first scourges Jesus in order to gain sympathy from the crowd, that they might let him go. He even pleads with them. He says, what crime has he done? So there's a certain amount. Of course, he eventually gives up because he doesn't want a riot breaking out, but there's a certain amount of effort that he makes in order to release Jesus. Even the idea of trying to influence the crowd to choose Barabbas so that he can let Jesus go, these are some of the things that Pilate attempts. So we can have a fairly sympathetic view of Pilate, where we think, well, maybe he wasn't such a bad guy. But actually we know from history that Pilate was a brutal man. We know from the historian Josephus that at certain points he killed many Samaritans. There's one point where he lines the whole route to Jerusalem with crosses of the enemies who have dared raise their hand against Rome. He was quite corrupt. He was taking a lot of bribes. He was just not a solid guy. And actually what was happening is either this time or shortly thereafter, it had gotten so bad that a delegation of Jews had gone to Rome to complain about Pilate's governorship, and Caesar was actually about to recall him and say, hey man, what are you doing? And he was going to get reassigned. So sometimes people have made much of that to say, okay, well, why is he so sympathetic in the Gospels? But we know he's actually a brutal soldier who crushes dissenters under his heel. But I think that is, we can see that even if Pilate is a brutal and pragmatic governor who is very willing to kill people who oppose Rome, I think he's still a Roman. And Romans thought very well of themselves in terms of justice. And so I think there's still a side to Pilate that even though he's a brute, he says, well, even though I'm like this, it's clearly that this guy doesn't deserve what's happening to him. So I think there's still a shred of honor in him that even such a tyrant as Pilate can see that something is rotten in the state of Palestine. I'm glad I got a chuckle out of it. He said something smells fishy here. So even someone like him can tell that there's something wrong here. And so that's a little bit of the background of Pilate. And so in a moment, Jesus will stand before Pilate. But in the meantime, we hear about what happens to Judas. And so we find out that Judas sees that Jesus has been condemned to death. And there's something about that really strikes Judas with remorse. My version says he changed his mind and that he brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. So he tries to return the money because now he is stricken and he changes his mind. What's interesting is that a different word is used in the Greek than the word for repentance, which is metanoia, because metanoia is a changing of the mind and the heart. It's a full change, which is repentance, where here he just has a change of mind. He realizes that he's done something wrong. And that's why I think we see what he does next in terms of committing suicide, that he is so stricken with this on his conscience that he doesn't feel like he can be forgiven at all. Now they are not very sympathetic to what's going on in him. But what's interesting here is he says in verse 4, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. And if you noticed as we were reading through, that's actually an emphasis here. Jesus' innocence is really emphasized in this text. So you have verse 4, innocent blood, right there. Verses 11 to 14, where Jesus is completely quiet before the governor, not saying a thing. And that silence of Jesus is his indictment of the whole thing. So he's declaring his innocence with his silence. And then if you go down to verse 19, Pilate's wife calls him a righteous man. Have nothing to do with that righteous man. So by calling him a righteous man means he shouldn't be put to death. He's innocent of these things. Even as we noticed, verse 18, for Pilate knew that it is out of envy that they delivered him up. So Pilate even knows that at least there's something wrong with this. And then I thought there was at least one more note that I noticed. Oh yeah, verse 23, where Pilate's pushing them for evidence, where he says, well, what evil has he done? Or we could say, what crime has he committed to deserve to be executed? So even there, Pilate is acknowledging that really there's no law that he's broken. He's innocent of these things. And the only reason he gives in to wash his hands is because there's a riot starting. And he wants to keep the people under control. So we see in various ways the innocence of Jesus is acknowledged here several times. So even Judas expresses that. He throws the 30 pieces of silver into the temple, probably the temple courts. He goes outside the city. He hangs himself. But the Jewish high priests, or the chief priests, they are still economical. They're not going to waste this money, but they can't, in good conscience, put it into the general treasury, since they recognize that it has been purchased for a dastardly deed. They call it blood money because of what will happen to Jesus.
We still have the field of blood.
Yes.
It's still there. We drove by it a few times, actually.
Yeah. And so their contingency plan is to take the money and buy a burial place for, my version is strangers, but probably the idea is for Gentiles. So Gentiles who die in Jerusalem and who can't be buried, in the sacred ground where Jewish people are buried, this will be the cemetery for Gentiles. called the Potter's Field. So that it's probably called the Potter's Field because it was most likely a kind of a garbage dump for pottery, as it was, where you break a pot, you throw it into the Potter's Field. And so, but Matthew uses this detail in verse 9 to refer to Jeremiah, because Jeremiah had mentioned this. In Jeremiah it said, they took 30 pieces of silver, the price of him on whom a price had been set by some of the sons of Israel, and they gave them for the Potter's Field as the Lord directed me. And I think what Matthew is indicating here, throughout the book of Matthew has really pointed us back to the Old Testament. Say, this is what the prophets had said. This fulfills the prophecies from the Old Testament. And by doing that right here, Matthew is indicating even the betrayal of Jesus by Judas did not happen by accident, or did not happen outside of God's will and purpose. That God had even predicted that this would happen, that the Potter's Field would be purchased with 30 pieces of silver. And so this is all happening according to God's plan and purpose and will, as evil and as sinful as the human actions within it are. So I think Matthew uses this fulfillment of the prophet Jeremiah just to remind us for a moment. Don't worry, God's got all of this under control, because he had even prophesied this in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Scriptures. And so that's Judas. It's another gospel that says that he fell headlong and his bowels burst apart, and so that's quite a graphic image. And so likely Judas had hung himself over a cliff, that when his body finally fell, that was what happened to him. Now anyway, in verse 11 we see now how Jesus is standing before the governor, so the most powerful man in the land. And the governor has in Matthew's gospel, there's only one question asked here: are you the king of the Jews? Jesus says, you have said so, which, as we said last time, is sort of like a you betcha, where Jesus answers in the affirmative. Now, in the Gospel of John, we actually have a much longer conversation between Pilate and Jesus. That's where Jesus says, yes, I am a king, but my kingdom is not of this world. He says, I've come to bring truth to this world, and they have that conversation. But here in Matthew, Jesus is primarily silent when the Jewish leaders are accusing him constantly. And even Pilate, it says at the end, he's greatly amazed. And Pilate says, well, don't you hear all these things, all these charges that they're testifying against you? And again says Jesus gave no answer. Now, we might wonder, well, why is Pilate amazed at this? Well, I think he's amazed because normally people who are facing the death penalty are very talkative. And they want to answer every charge that is brought against them. No, that is not true. Here is my evidence. Here is what actually happened. How can you believe them? Or maybe they're begging, please, please, don't do this to me. Whereas Jesus is not like any criminal that Pilate has ever seen. He is silent. He gives no answer. And I think that's, as I said before, I think that's Jesus' way of condemning the whole thing. Because remember, Jesus was silent before the council. The whole Jewish council back in chapter 26, Jesus was silent the whole time until the high priest finally put him under oath before God. And Jesus was compelled to speak. Where in this case, everything they bring against him, Jesus is not even going to dignify it with an answer. And I think in doing so, Jesus is testifying of his own innocence, and the governor is truly amazed at this. And so that brings us to verse 15. It says, "Now at the feast," so this is the Passover feast, "there is a tradition." It says, "The governor was accustomed to release for the crowd any one prisoner whom they wanted." I believe that another gospel says that this was the tradition of the people that the governor allowed and granted. And I think this was a way of allowing the pressure out of the Passover feast. Because the city of Jerusalem was not a great big city. It had walls, so it had not a whole lot of space to begin with. But I've read that over Passover, with Jewish people coming from all over the world, there could be as many as 1 million people in Jerusalem and staying all around, all the time. So Passover, as being the greatest feast of the year, that is when you have all Roman security on highest alert, because if something goes down and gets out of hand, then everyone's in a lot of trouble. And I think that's even the background where why Pilate gives in fairly quickly when he realizes that things are getting out of hand. But I think this is a way to release one prisoner at the feast, was a way of, allowing a little bit of pressure release. And so, okay, well, we've been really nice, we've been really magnanimous to allow one prisoner to go free out of our prison, and so keep everything calm during this week while we have this feast. So that appears to be what's going on here. And Pilate, he could have chosen sort of anybody to be released. But it seems like he's using this as a ploy to say, Jesus is obviously innocent. He hasn't broken any Roman laws. So let's make a deal here. Let's get this guy off. He's going to help the Jewish people, the Jewish leaders rather, save face in this moment. So that he's giving them an exit ramp right here. Okay, if the people pick Jesus, then good. Okay, I didn't have to put to death an innocent man and deal with all the consequences of that. So that seems to be what's going on here. And he chooses, my version says in verse 16, they had a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. Notorious prisoner. Other Gospels, I believe, call him a bandit and an insurrectionist. So I think in modern day language, we'd probably call him a terrorist. He is someone who, really, most likely, it was his cross that Jesus took. So most likely, the thief or the bandits on the right and left hand of Jesus were probably Barabbas' lieutenants. And the three of them were set to be executed on that Friday. And Jesus literally took Barabbas' place, most likely. But what's interesting is, I think in both versions that were read over there, Barabbas has an extra name. What was his extra name? Jesus. Yeah. So isn't that amazing? And that is true. Not all the Greek manuscripts have that, and so that's why some of our versions will not have that name there. But some of the manuscripts do have it, which is why some of our translations include it. And then we consider the name Barabbas. Bar means son of. Does anyone remember what Abba means if we take the S off?
Father.
Father. So what does Barabbas mean?
Son of Father.
Son of the Father. Jesus, Son of the Father, is going to be replaced by Jesus, Son of the Father. Isn't that amazing? And the Gospels never explain that. It's like a little Easter egg that they've placed in the text to say, yeah, wink, wink. This is what's happening right here. That this kind of Al Capone figure, this notorious prisoner named Jesus, Son of the Father, he's going to go scot-free. And Jesus, the innocent one, the Christ, he is actually literally going to take the place of the cross that was meant for him that day. And so, everybody's gathered together. And I like to think this is a very large crowd here. Because I think if this was a tradition, year by year, I think this would be quite an event. So I think there'd be a very great crowd gathered from Jerusalem, anticipating the release of one prisoner from the Roman dungeon. And Pilate just gives them this sort of binary choice. Sort of like, do you want this terrorist that we all hate? Do you want him released? Or do you want Jesus? And he doesn't say it, but he's like, who we all know is innocent. Who do you want here? And in verse 18, it says, it gives us a little explanation. For Pilate knew that it was out of envy that they had delivered him up. So Pilate knows these are political games. And that's why he's actually making an effort to allow Jesus to be set free. Then, only Matthew has this next detail of Pilate's wife. We only find this in Matthew's Gospel. So this even amps up the tension even more. So Pilate already suspected something was up, and then now he gets a message from his wife saying that she has suffered greatly in a dream, and that he should really avoid doing anything to this righteous man. He is a righteous man. And so, of course, even if Pilate is a pagan Roman, worships many gods, he would interpret a dream of his wife to have spiritual effect. That he would obviously not believe in the God of Israel, but he would say, okay, through my wife's dream, the gods are trying to tell me something, that maybe I should not have this guy, maybe I should not mess with this guy. That's what Matthew's telling us there. So everything's building on itself, that Pilate should probably let this guy go. And so maybe he thinks at this point, okay, surely they're going to release Jesus. Nobody wants Barabbas back in the population. I'm sure they're going to pick Jesus. But what's very interesting is verse 20. Because remember, if this is a great crowd of people gathered here, then many people in this crowd would have, just 1 week prior, they would have been saying, Hosanna to the Son of David, to welcome Jesus into Jerusalem. And so we might wonder, what happens in this moment? How can they go from Hosanna to the Son of David, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, on Sunday, and then on early Friday morning, they're saying, crucify him, away with this guy, his blood be on us and on our children. What happens in that moment? And I think verse 20 tells us how, or it gives us a hint or a clue as to how the Jewish leaders changed their minds about Jesus in this moment. It says, now the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus, my version says. A strong word, destroy him. Now, what is the only major thing that has happened between then and now? Is what Jesus has told the Supreme Court. So I think all that they would have to do is have all their cronies mixing with the crowd and say, did you hear what that Jesus guy just said before the high priest? He claimed to be the Son of God. He claimed to be divine. And when people would start hearing that in the crowd, their minds would change about Jesus in a moment. Because it's okay if he's the Son of David. It's okay if he's the Messiah. It's okay if he is the king that they've been waiting for. But the king that they've been waiting for is an earthly human king. But if all now they're hearing whispers, no, he claimed to be the Son of God. He claimed to be God himself. Then they would turn on a dime, and now they agree with the high priest. They agree with the Sanhedrin council. They agree, yes, this blasphemer must die. So I think that's what's happening here. It says, they are convinced, they're persuaded by the leadership to destroy Jesus. And so this is what happens. He says, the governor says, which one do you want me to release to you? And they all cry out in one voice, Barabbas. And then Pilate says, well, then what should I do with Jesus, who is called Christ? And they say, let him be crucified. And they are adamant that he should be taken away and nailed to a cross and executed in the most horrific way possible. So in spite of the protestations of the governor saying he has committed no evil crime, he's broken no law, they want him put to death. Because they are seized with the same kind of zeal as the Jewish leaders themselves. That if he claims to be the Son of God, he claims divinity for himself, then he must die. And so that does bring us to our last little section where we'll end for today, where Pilate sees that he's losing. He's losing the crowd here. It says, my version says, he was gaining nothing, but rather a riot was beginning. So this is what's so beautiful about Scripture, is sometimes you can just imagine it. It doesn't take a whole lot of imagination to put yourself right there. How this whole group of Jewish people are screaming at the top of their lungs, crucify him, kill him, away with him. They are screaming and calling for his blood. And now you can envision them pushing against the Roman soldiers and guards. And things are beginning, maybe they're beginning to throw rocks and stones, and things are getting dicey now. And the governor's now seeing all of this, that a riot was beginning to form. And this is not his first rodeo. He knows when riots are beginning to form, and he sees this. So I think quite quickly he gets water in a wash basin and he washes his hands. That shows to everyone symbolically, I'm done with this matter. I wash my hands of this man's blood. I'm innocent of it. Even that's another indicator that he believes that Jesus is innocent. But he doesn't take responsibility. He says, see to it yourselves. Which means, okay, fine. Have it your way then. And so Pilate would much rather keep the peace. He would much rather keep the Pax Romana than to preserve true justice in letting Jesus go. And then in verse 25, there's a very chilling response from the people. And all the people answered, his blood be on us and on our children. I know that in the past there have been anti-Semites, anti-Semitic authors and thinkers who have used that verse to say, well, the blood of Jesus is upon the Jewish people, so that's why we can treat the Jewish people very badly and very poorly. But what they're really saying is his blood be upon us and on our children. Yes, they are taking responsibility for it, but you can read it in a certain way that says, well, his sprinkled blood can also save them and their children. They don't mean it in that way, but as we read it in the light of all of Scripture, we can see that it's not as though the Jewish people are ejected or rejected. The gospel is to go forth to all nations, and salvation is for the Jewish people as well. But the people here are taking this responsibility upon themselves, and so we see in verse 26 at the end there, Pilate releases, he keeps his word, he releases Barabbas for them, and it says he scourges Jesus and he hands him over to the execution squad so that he can be crucified. And then we will see next week how that continues to happen on Jesus' road to the cross. Bye, Tom. Good to see you.
Yeah, take care. Thanks.
See you later.
And I suppose as we just conclude, I think one of the main things we see here is, as we said earlier, there's an emphasis on Jesus' innocence. That Jesus doesn't deserve this at all. And yet, even though Pilate seems to be in charge, the Jewish leaders seem to be in charge, even the Jewish people seem to be in charge and calling for his death, really this is happening according to God's plan and purpose, even in terms of the fulfilled prophecy from the Old Testament. That God is really using this ultimately for his glory, even though these things from a human earthly perspective are terrible. And I find that is a comfort, that when we are experiencing and going through hard times, we can know that God is still on his throne, God is still in control of the process, that he's still working all things together for good, and that we can trust in him for that. And that ultimately this was for our salvation. That this is the will of God that Jesus himself submitted himself to. Let's leave it there for today, and we'll continue on next week.